Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So recently I did a video which partly covered the topic of canted grips, or so-called French grips, and pistol or orthopaedic grips on modern fencing weapons. This is a French grip on an épée, and I, in passing, mentioned that I wasn't really a fan of the orthopaedic grips very much, and in fact I wasn't really a fan of the canted grips very much either, simply because the majority of the original weapons that these were originally supposed to be practice weapons for did not have that kind of grip. They tended to have straight grips. However, there were certainly canted grips of various kinds on many historical weapons, some of which are still in use today in some parts of the world. They are canted for a number of different reasons. It can either be to increase or facilitate certain types of cutting or cutting capacity. So in other words, to make a cut hit with a little bit more power, or hit with a certain part of the blade, or indeed to facilitate certain types of push cut or draw cut. It can also be used to assist the cut in terms of giving direction, aiding edge alignment essentially, and making the cut therefore more effective in those terms as well. What I've got here is an example of a sword that you very often find with a very slightly canted grip. Okay, and you'll notice that it's only very slightly canted forwards towards the cutting edge in relation to the base of the blade, and actually this feature of being very slightly angled towards the cutting edge of the blade is something you find on a very large number of particularly sabres and types of sabre from all over the world. You find it on 19th century military sabres, but they're emulating what you see on earlier Hungarian and Polish, in other words, mid-European and Eastern European sabres. And indeed you see the same thing on Mongolian swords, on certain types of Chinese sabre, and it's a feature, as I say, and you see it on Southeast Asian sabres as well. It's a feature you see on a wide number of sabre-like implements, and you sometimes see it to some degree on medieval messers, although it does seem that whilst the medieval messer probably gave rise to certain types of sabre that we see in the 16th, 17th century, it does seem that generally speaking the messer, or Langsmesser, or Grossmesser as we should more precisely call it, that is the large messer, the large knife of the medieval period, it does seem that generally speaking they had straight grips, but there is some suggestion that they started to get kind of sloped grips in the later period, and we see this in early Hungarian sabres from the 16th, 15th and 16th centuries that do very often have this canted forward grip. An interesting thing just to briefly note is that Japanese swords and a handful of other swords, for example the Bornean Da, actually sit outside of what's normal in terms of that, in that very often with Japanese swords, and certain Chinese swords as well, the curve actually carries on the curvature of the blade, and so in that sense they're actually canted backwards away from the cutting edge, and that's very unusual on a global scale. Most cutting swords that have a canted grip tends to be canted towards the cutting edge. Japanese swords are different in that they're canted generally either straight or away from the cutting edge, and of course that adds to the idea that they're used for a very particular type of cutting, with preference anyway, a preference for a certain type of cutting. Our old favourite, the Tulwar, also fits within this trend that we see equally in European sabres, that very, very often the grip is canted in the direction, or the pommel is canted in the direction of the cutting edge. And that's interesting because we know for a fact that Indo-Persian swords, and the same goes for the Shamshir as well, were used with drawing cuts almost exclusively, and sometimes push cuts, but this was really something accentuated according to European writers on the subject at the time that the swords were still in use. So it's interesting that they were doing pretty much exclusively drawing and pushing cutting in India and in the Middle East with canted forward grips, and yet in Japan they seem to have perhaps also been doing pushing and drawing cutting, but with canted backwards grips. It's a bit strange, and it is actually something that Sir Richard Francis Burton notes in some of his writings, that the Japanese sword is kind of a bit weird in that it sits outside of the normal trend for a canted forward grip for cutting swords. So the canted forward grip can be to make a sword more effective for cutting, either because of the way that you cut or simply because it delivers the edge more with more force and with better edge alignment. But very clearly that is not an issue when it comes to the épée. Okay, the canted forward grip, or canted sideways and forward in fact grip on an épée, is purely to bring the point more easily in line whilst fencing. Okay, so clearly there is a second possible reason to have a canted forward grip, and that is to bring the point online, and that is to apply the point more easily. Now what is conspicuous is that with Renaissance period swords, despite the fact that the rapier was very heavily favouring the thrust and very heavily designed to favour the thrust, and in fact fencing doctrine of the time was predominantly in favour of the thrust as well, we do not see canted grips on rapiers, and you might ask why. And the basic reason is probably because they have the finger over the ricasso, and when you finger the ricasso, so to speak, your hand comes more naturally into this sort of pistol grip anyway, so there's not really a need to further cant the grip to assist with thrusting. But equally, it should always be remembered that whilst the rapier is a predominantly thrusting sword, it is still a cut and thrust sword, and it's still a sword that was sometimes used in war, of course, so you still need to be able to cut and thrust with it, either from horseback or on foot. And equally, you need to be able to fight against a wide variety of opposing weapons. Okay, you need to be able to parry strongly with it, so that it's not only there to deliver the point like an épée is, and the épée it only deals with other épées, and of course it's a very light weapon, parrying very light weapons. The rapier may well have to parry a spear or a staff, or in some cases something as extreme as a halberd, as well as of course backswords, broadswords, falchions and sabres. Okay, so it has to deal with a wide variety of different weapons, and is more versatile in that sense, and has to be able to parry very strongly against sometimes heavier or more forceful weapons than itself. So the canted grip did, in a way, it's not only a fencing weapon thing, it did in a way reach its kind of apex in military terms with sabres at the end of the 19th century. So particularly with cavalry sabres, there was a movement towards the end of the 19th century towards real specialisation to the thrust. Okay, but equally there were certain developments led probably initially, you would say, in Italy, because by the 1870s they were starting to appear, to really make the hilts on sabres, be they straight or curved, to make them really specialised to this thumb up type of grip, which naturally brings the point more in line. I'll just grab a sword, brings the point more in line with the forearm, which of course makes it better for, or easier shall we say, for thrusting and applying the point in line. Okay, and so what I have here is a Spanish 1895 model of a cavalry sabre. In fact, this has a curved blade, it's a cut and thrust sword, but very soon after this, in I believe it was 1905 or thereabouts, the Spanish replaced it with a thrusting blade instead. But you'll see that this grip, just put that there, is very much specialised to gripping in this fashion. Now it is interesting to note that actually the pommel is still in line with the blade. Okay, so it's not a pistol grip as such, it's not even really a canted grip, but you'll notice that the shape is very much specialised. You can't even really comfortably hold it in a hammer fist. It's very much specialised to put your index finger over there and your thumb up the back, and in fact, if I just turn it around carefully, there's actually a swelling, I hope you can see just here, so that when giving point, as they called it, in other words when thrusting, your thumb wouldn't be rammed up into that guard because of this swelling, or indeed the index finger wouldn't be rammed up in the guard very easily, because they're at a narrow point and they can't get past this sort of bulb on the grip. Okay, and so the hilt is very much designed to keep your hand in this position, and you can cut and thrust with it quite comfortably. But it's not really a pistol grip, it's not really what I would call an orthopaedic grip, although it does relate to the whole topic. What perhaps you could say was the apex of this sort of design was the British 1908 pattern cavalry sword and the American 1913 pattern, so-called pattern sabre, although it's not a sabre, it's a sword because it's straight, of course. And both of these have forms of pistol grip, perhaps inspired in part by this earlier Spanish model and other Italian models and other models that were out there following a similar kind of theory. And they have a placer for the thumb, and they put the hand in a very specific position that actually makes the sword quite poor for general fencing or even cutting. But very, very well catered to giving point, that is using the point, and specifically from horseback. And it is worth noting that they didn't apply this type of grip. Certainly in Britain and America, in most other countries, they didn't apply this type of grip to infantry officers' swords. Infantry officers' swords retained, that is sabres, retained a more or less straight grip where the pommel was in line with the blade, because that's what kind of works best for fencing on foot. The British 1908 sword and the American 1913 pattern sword are really, and I have said this on many threads and in many comments, are really one-handed lances. They're for giving point on horseback and not really for doing much else with. They're not very good for parrying, they're pretty poor as fencing weapons. Okay, so they're one-handed lances. So I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of first the 1908 and then the 1913, so you can see what I'm talking about. Another batch of sabres worth mentioning in this context are the Swedish models that are mostly from kind of 1860 to about 1900, and they have particularly curved grips and are held in a very specific fashion. They are somewhat of a pistol grip. The Swedes were quite special, shall we say, in this period, in that they had their own style of fencing that took inspiration from others, but was quite individual and special to Sweden, and in fact their own sword designs as well. They didn't just copy other people's like lots of other European countries did. So I'll show you a picture now of a typical kind of Swedish sabre of the later part of the 19th century, and you'll see it's got kind of what we call a pistol grip. In fact, that Swedish sabre is a cut and thrust sword. It's not specifically a thrusting sword, so this type of canted grip is there to presumably make cutting better and to assist with use of the point as well. However, I should reiterate, this is quite a particular thing for Swedish infantry officers, cavalry and cutlasses, and it didn't really catch on outside of Sweden as a style of hilt. So I'll show you a picture of one of those now. So I will also briefly mention that canted grips or angled grips, or what we might call pistol grips, are also sometimes found on knives. Okay, so this is a sort of Bowie knife type thing. It is 19th century, from about 1880 probably, and it's German made, but probably made for the Argentinian market, because this is a particular style of hilt that you find on Argentinian machetes in specific from the mid to late 19th century. And here they've applied it to a Bowie knife type blade, and it's actually very, very comfortable to hold. It's got a nice groove there for the little finger. Your little finger goes into it. I would naturally hold it with the thumb up the back. It doesn't have any form of guard. It's a bit like a Khyber knife in that sense, in that the guard is created by the fact that the blade is wider than the hilt, it kind of does bring the point more aligned, although I find you can get the same kind of grip with a coffin hilt or even a straight, normal straight hilt. But nevertheless, it's another example of the canted grip. And of course, another famous example of canted forward grips is on the kukri. Now, kukris weren't generally used to thrust with. in the sense that we would normally think of thrusting. It was more like a push cut than a thrust, probably. So in this sense, I think we can put this within the group of canted forward grips, much like most sabres, where really the canted forward is to assist with the cut, be it a draw cut or a push cut, and it really brings, much like an axe, it assists in bringing that edge forward of the sort of axis of the lever, as it were, so it hits in front of where you would normally expect a straight stick to hit. So that's probably there mostly to assist with cutting. However, it is worth mentioning that this type of arrangement, whereby this primary cutting portion of the blade is at an angle of about 45 degrees to my hand, does mean that I could apply the point very, very well with it, although I'd probably with a kukri be doing it more with a push cut than a thrust per se, for various reasons that I won't go into in this video. Okay, so there is another well-known example of the canted grip. Another example of the canted grip or pistol grip we see on Southeast Asian, mostly Indonesian and Malaysian, Kris. Now this is a type of dagger. I'll show you some pictures of ones in a minute, and sometimes these have straight grips, sometimes they have slightly canted grips, and sometimes they have very canted grips. So I've pulled off a few examples of very canted grips and I'll show you them now. This was of course primarily a thrusting dagger, usually a blade of about 12 inches, 10 or 12 inches, and very clearly this is to assist with the use of the point. And last up, so we've looked at canted forward grips, we've looked at pistol grips, none of them really like an orthopaedic grip like you would see on some modern épée and foils. But there is a final type of historical grip that's different to the conventional straight grip that you do see particularly on Indian Katars and putter. Okay, a Katar is one of these. Some of you will know it as a punch dagger. In actual fact, in Europe and America we did have punch daggers, and they follow the same principle, that you're gripping something at 90 degrees to the point, and they were usually very small and very concealable, often known as gamblers' knives and things like this. So they were concealable self-defense or self-offense daggers that were stuck under your your jacket or your top of your trousers or such like. But the Indian Katar, a very popular weapon for a long period of time in India, around until probably they were common until about the beginning of the 19th century or end of the 18th century. But they started out, I believe, in about the 16th century, okay, the earliest forms. I'll show you a bunch in a minute, a bunch of different ones. Some of them are very clearly made as anti-armour weapons because they have a reinforced point. I don't know how well you can see that here, but the steel is much thicker before the point than it is back here. So some were clearly like Europe's rondel daggers. They were designed to punch through mail. Some of them were made of cut down sword blades, presumably where a sword blade had broken and they mounted it onto a Katar so they could still use the blade for something. And you get pronged types, you get two-bladed types. There's a wide variety, and I have seen Indian artwork where in fact they strapped or bound the bars here that go either side of your hand to the wrist as well. I don't know why you would do that. In Indian artwork, these are normally worn in a scabbard, incidentally, but it's tucked into a sash at the front there. So you'd have a sword and a shield, or perhaps a spear, a sword and a shield, or a gun, a sword and a shield as your primary weapons, and then this would be a kind of backup close-in weapon for if you come into grappling distance. Okay, so the Katar, popular weapon, well known, well recognised, I'm sure you all well aware of that. And that, whilst it's not what we would call a pistol grip or an orthopaedic grip, it is this kind of right-angled bar grip. And I'll also show you some pictures of putter. What a putter is essentially that theory, that grip, applied to a sword length blade, and usually, the pictures I show will show this, usually with an overlaid metal gauntlet, and the metal gauntlet is really there to protect your hand. In regards to the use of the putter, we don't know an awful lot. We know that they're predominantly cavalry weapons, and I suspect that they were probably used pretty much like a one-handed lance for thrusting. I shouldn't think they were used very much for cutting, although I might be wrong on that, because hands up, I don't know much about that weapon, and I don't think very many other people out there do either. Okay, so there we go, that's the final kind of weapon that might apply to this kind of theory of having a pistol grip or an orthopaedic grip on a dagger or sword. Okay, some pictures to follow. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers.